All right, welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 15, Years of Crisis, Section 1, Post-War Uncertainty. So we are in this chapter kind of going to look at some of the things going on between the two world wars and sort of some of the events that precipitate the second one. All right. Now, main idea for today's notes, science and technology. So a lot of what we're going to look at today is science and technology related, and the post-war period is one of these times of great loss. Obviously, a lot of people have lost their lives. There is a great deal of uncertainty in this period, but it is also going to be one of a lot of inventions and creativity and new ideas coming out, especially in the 1920s and 30s. Now, why are we looking at this? Why does it matter today? Well, post-war trends in physics, psychiatry, art, literature, communication, music, and transportation, and yes, we are literally going to hit all of those points today, are going to have lasting effects on today's society and culture. All of these things, a lot of these things, are things that we still deal with in today's world. Okay, first off, a new revolution in science. In 1905, we start to see the first rumblings of a little gentleman named Albert Einstein. He is, probably, if you ask somebody, name a scientist or name a great thinking mathematician, people probably are going to come up with either, Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein, something like that. But Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton have something in common in the sense that they're both dealing, generally speaking, with physics and how the world works. And like I said, by 1905, Albert Einstein, who's actually a mail clerk in Germany at the time, is giving the world some very new, interesting ideas. It's not until really the 20s or after the First World War that we really start to see a lot of these published and in general thought of what's going on. But Einstein gives us this thing called the theory of relativity. And what he basically does is he theorizes that while the speed of light is constant, things like time and space are relative. Generally, the example that's given on this is that basically if you move at the speed of light, time will, for you, be, you'll perceive it to move at a normal rate, but everything that's not moving at your speed will actually move much faster. So if you are in a spaceship and you leave your twin brother or sister on the Earth, and you travel at the speed of light for 5 years, you go all around the solar system, and then you come back after what for you has been 5 years at the speed of light, everyone here will be dead and gone because our time has traveled much faster. So the time, perceivable time, here will be much longer than it was when you were traveling at the speed of light. So time at the speed of light kind of slows down. Okay? Now that's very complicated, and I'm not going to make you give me a detailed explanation of that, but just be aware that he's giving us these ideas about the interrelationships between time and space and between energy and matter. One of the other things that the theory of relativity, which sometimes people remember as E equals mc squared, is actually that, basically energy is matter, and matter is energy, and it can be transferred into and away from each other, or, to and from, anyway. Einstein's ideas make the world seem a lot less certain for people because for many people it's like he's bending the rules of physics and how the world works. It's not that we're really bending the rules of physics here, we just have a better understanding of physics. And for a lot of people, Newtonian physics have been all they knew, and so this is very strange and new to them. So it does bring some uncertainty into the world. Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity are both your vocab terms, which you can see here. Albert Einstein is a German-born physicist who devised the theory of relativity. I should point out, but this isn't really relevant to what we're talking about, that he also helps us in our nuclear program in the United States. All right. Another great scientific mind that comes out around the period of the interwar period, or the early 20th century, is Sigmund Freud. And I know a lot of you are going to read that and go, hey, that looks like Freud. Please don't be Bill and Ted from The Excellent Adventure. But it is Sigmund Freud. Around this time, Freud basically says that the human behavior is irrational. I mean, he's a neurologist, so he's looking at how the mind works. Or basically that humans are beyond reason. We're not logical beings, even though, the entire idea of logic comes out of our minds. But he says, we are irrational, we're beyond reason. He says that there is, in fact, a portion of our mind called the unconscious, which is irrational. And it drives people to seek pleasure, and this section of our mind cannot be controlled. So, the fact that in the morning you hit the snooze button to sleep a little bit more, that you like that big piece of chocolate cake or a slice of pizza, that, this is not me being childish, but it is a real thing, that we seek, sexual pleasure in some cases. This is what Sigmund Freud is saying, is uncontrollable. This is what we are, pre-programmed to do. It's not something we have any control over. This weakened people's faith and reason because, we thought we were in control of ourselves, but no, Sigmund Freud, this greatly respected neurologist, says, no, you're not, and there's nothing you can do about that. Sigmund Freud is also one of your vocab terms here. He's an Austrian-born doctor with new ideas about how the mind and how it works. And he also pioneered something called psychoanalysis. So he would have people explain or tell them their dreams, and then he would try to interpret them for him, or for them, rather. In any case, by the 1920s, Freud's theories had developed widespread influence, and a lot of people were reading his work. All right, let's shift gears, and then we'll talk about literature in the 1920s. The brutality of World War I caused philosophers and writers to question accepted ideas about reason and progress. So a lot of these people are disillusioned by the war. Many are also feared the future and expressed doubts about traditional religious beliefs. So some writers and thinkers expressed their anxieties by creating disturbing visions of the present and the future. These writers and philosophers of this period are often called the Lost Generation, and because they're profoundly affected by the war, they often wrote about it and the concerns of society. So they are kind of a different group. In many of these writers' search for meaning in an uncertain world, some thinkers turn to this philosophy known as existentialism, and a major leader of this movement was actually the guy who we see quoted in this poster here, Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre, of France. His existentialists basically believed that there's no universal meaning to life, and that each person creates his or her own meaning in life through the choices and actions that are taken. So you see Sartre is quoted here, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. There's no universal meaning to life, you make your own meaning. So existentialism is one of your vocab terms down here. He is basically saying, or existentialism is basically saying that a philosophy based on the idea that people give meaning to their lives through their choices and actions. So based on what I'm doing, I'm teaching. My meaning in life would be to teach or to convey knowledge to others. Maybe yours is to tweet on Twitter or make posts on Facebook. Maybe that is what your meaning to life is. Maybe some of your lives and actions are to become great scientists or mathematicians. But existentialism says you create whatever your meaning is by your own actions, your own choices. Okay? So this gives a lot of people uncertainty. Maybe a lot of people before this believed that, a supreme being gave them their meaning to their life, and these people are generally kind of anti-religious and say, no, you make those decisions for yourself. Now, existentialists were influenced by one particular German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. And in the 1880s, Nietzsche wrote the Western ideas that Western ideas such as democracy and progress and reason had stifled people's creativity and actions. Nietzsche urged a return to the ancient heroic values of pride, assertiveness, and strength, and his ideas attracted growing attention in the 20th century and had become a great impact on politics, particularly in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Indeed, Adolf Hitler and probably Mussolini had both read a lot of Nietzsche, and particularly Hitler is impacted by this because Nietzsche has another idea called the Übermensch, or the Superman, and part of his idea of Germans becoming the quote-unquote master race of the world comes from Hitler's readings of Nietzsche. So he is a bit influenced by him, let's just say. All right. Going from that, let's talk about something a little lighter. We're going to talk about art. although we're going to talk about some kind of strange art. Revolution in the arts here. So many new directions in arts are going to evolve out of post-World War Europe and the United States, and artists are generally going to kind of rebel against traditional means of conveying music and art and various other things. First, we're going to talk about visual art here. So artists wanted to depict kind of how the mind works, or show the inner world of the mind, and how strange, in fact, that can be. I mean, if you've never thought something strange or had a strange dream, maybe that is difficult for you to imagine, but our minds are capable of some very strange sort of events, things that we don't necessarily actually see in the real world, and even some of the things that we see in the real world kind of blow our minds. So we are very interesting creatures in the sense of how our mind works. And a lot of art during this period shows sort of the strangeness of it. Cubism, which I'll actually show you in a slide next, is very different. And it turns a lot of natural shapes into geometric forms, something that we can imagine in our mind but not necessarily see in the real world. Something that also, this whole genre that comes out during this period of time is called surrealism, and it surfaces during the early part of the 1900s and really becomes fairly popular in the 1920s and 30s. And many of these paintings, and one here you can see by Dali called The Persistence of Memory, but many of these paintings are very unusual and show very dreamlike type situations, things that literally you'd never see in the real world. Clocks do not melt or bend over tree branches, and you don't see half of someone's face. This is supposed to be Dali, just kind of melted or sitting on the floor of a canyon. It doesn't really make sense, but it is one of your vocab terms, and it is this new style of 20th century artistic movement that focuses on the workings of the unconscious mind and often features very strange and odd subjects. Oh, I told you I would show you some cubism. Here is cubism. So this is a piece called A Violin and a Candlestick by Georges Braque, and then also on the right here you can see Pablo Picasso's Three Musicians, which shows three musicians playing various instruments, including a clarinet and a guitar, and I have a bit of a difficult time making out the third one, but they are very squared off. This is actually a mixed media thing, so he did this with, I believe, paper and felt, but he's changing things that clearly would have been rounded, that would have looked like people, into squares and other geometric shapes. So these are a couple of different ideas that are coming out in visual art during this period. Also during this time we have a bit of music that is here. And since we are going to talk about music, I'm going to give you 30 seconds of music so we can kind of see what that sounds like here. Sounded good, didn't it? I enjoy that kind of music myself occasionally. That was actually a Japanese artist who does some jazz over there named Yoko Kanno. It is from a television show actually called Cowboy Bebop. But anyway, so jazz pretty much sounds like that. Depending, I mean, you can go out and listen to all manner of different jazz, and you'll find different styles, of course. But that just gives you kind of an idea of what jazz tends to sound like. Composers during this time are going to move away, obviously, from traditional styles of music like classical music and that sort of thing. And you're going to hear a lot more in the 1920s, especially of jazz and things that are really offbeat and very, upbeat, very strong sounding music like that. It's very lively, often offbeat. Sometimes they change tempo in the middle of jazz. And jazz, if you're ever actually a jazz artist, or some of you have ever played jazz, is really hard to learn because it kind of goes all over the place. And a lot of it's very, spur of the moment type music. You're collaborating and improvising with other artists. So jazz is very interesting, but very different than what a lot of other music was coming around the period before this was like. Okay. It is also, I should mention, kind of the forerunner of a lot of music that we currently listen to. So rock and hip hop and rap and even country music to some point is all influenced on some level, and R&B as well, by jazz. So it is the forerunner of a lot of our current popular music. Jazz is one of your vocab terms down there. It is a 20th century style of popular music developed mainly, and I should mention this also, by African American musicians. One in particular, seen in this poster, is Louis Armstrong, or he is also known as Satchmo. But there are a lot of very famous African American musicians that come up with a lot of the jazz that we hear in the 1920s. Now, to get away from art, and we're going to take another shift in gears here, we're going to look at sort of some of the changes in society during the 1920s, and one in particular that is of note, and you probably see a lot more of this when you go into U.S. history, but women's roles changing in the 1920s. So women take on a new role during World War I. A lot of them are involved in production for the war effort, and World War I had disturbed a lot of traditional social patterns. The new ideas and ways of life led to new kind of individual freedom during the 1920s. Young people especially were willing to break with the past and experiment with new modern ideas and values, and women were one of these groups that especially got into this. The independent spirit of the times showed clearly in the changes women were making in their lives. The war had allowed women to take on new roles, obviously, and their work in the war effort was decisive in helping them win the right to vote. After the war, women's suffrage became a law in many countries. That is, they were allowed the right to vote, including the United States, Britain, Germany, Sweden, and Austria. So a lot of different places. Women abandoned also restrictive clothing and hairstyles. They wore a lot of new kind of fashion during this period. You can see some women here on the right in flapper dresses and sort of 1920s-esque hats, high-heeled shoes, things that generally before the 1920s would have been considered kind of faux pas. Short haircuts were also very common. Just generally a lot of new fashion. In fact, you can start to see women wearing pants during this period, which you're thinking like, wow, Mr. Berry, pants, awesome. Yeah, that was not generally very common before then. So although most women still followed traditional paths of marriage and family, growing numbers spoke out for greater freedoms in their lives, and people like Margaret Sanger and Emma Goldman risked arrest by speaking in favor of birth control, and women also sought new careers. Many of these women are going to go into medicine, education, journalism, and other professions as well. So things that women would not normally have worked in are now kind of becoming acceptable after the First World War. All right, let's talk about some technological advances that are going on during after the First World War. This is sort of during it, but automobiles and cars first, let's talk about. While cars had existed before World War I, they obviously are going to improve greatly after the First World War. They are more powerful, they're easier to drive. A lot of the conventions about how we actually operate cars are developed after the First World War. Many of them are very confusing and difficult to drive before so. And cars also become a lot less expensive due to mass manufacturing. Henry Ford, in particular, is very helpful in getting a lot of mass manufacturing off. Cars are now sleek and brightly polished. They have complete with headlights and chrome-plated bumpers. Let's say, for example, in Britain, before World War I, autos were generally exclusively owned by rich people. British factories probably produced maybe 34,000 of them in 1913. But after the war, when prices dropped and middle-class people could actually afford cars, in 1937, for example, the British were producing something like 511,000 cars a year. So people could actually start to afford these things. I should also point out that increased auto use by the average family led to a bunch of lifestyle changes, and more people traveled for pleasure. In Europe and the United States, new businesses opened to serve the mobile interests, things like, gas stations and that kind of thing, but rest stops and that sort of thing also start to appear. And the auto also affected where people lived and worked, because people could actually move into what now we understand to be the suburbs and commute to work in the cities. They didn't necessarily have to live around where they worked. Another technological advance that takes place during the time after World War I is kind of the development of the airplane. Now, during World War I, obviously, we have seen the use of airplanes in dogfighting and in taking down observational balloons and that kind of thing. But airplanes were becoming much better after the First World War. Because of this, a lot of people made international air travel kind of a goal of theirs, and they were going to get airplanes into such a way that you could actually do this. One man who actually captured a lot of attention and showed that international, air travel was possible was this gentleman named Charles Lindbergh, and he's actually an American, so a lot of people are aware of him as one of the kind of pioneers of flight. Now, the reason he is famous is because he made the world's first solo flight from New York to Paris over a period of 33 hours in his airplane called the Spirit of St. Louis, which you can see him standing in front of here. At this point, only rich people could really afford planes or air travel for that matter, because there really weren't that many planes that were large enough to take a trip in. Most of them were one or two seaters and were excessively expensive to travel in. You could do it, but it was just not cheap. Obviously now we can all go down to Greenville-Spartanburg Airport if we want to, and pick up a ticket this afternoon and go to Abu Dhabi if we want to. I mean, we might take a couple different jumps there and have a passport, but we can go do that if we want. So it's not just a travel mode of the rich people, although it is still a little bit more expensive. Charles Lindbergh is one of your vocab terms. He is an American pilot who in 1927 made the first solo transatlantic flight from New York City to Paris in 33 hours' time. Also, technological advances improve life in the sense that you now have more forms of entertainment in the 1920s. In the 20s, things like commercial radio station and movies are going to spread across the United States. There are, a lot of advantages to radio. I still listen to the radio. This is how I know, even at the age of 27, I am an old man. But radio provides people with a source of news, music, obviously, that's what most people listen to on the radio, and even sporting events are starting to become broadcast. So you don't necessarily have to go places to get information. You can just sit in your house with your radio and learn many new things. Motion pictures also became a major industry in the 1920s, and it is, of course, today considered a major art form, a serious art form. And actually, the 1920s is where you start to see the beginning of the Academy Awards or the Oscars show. So they are actually awarding movies, for their artistic value. And if there's a fun fact here also that 90% of all films during the 1920s are actually made in Los Angeles or around what would become Hollywood, even though Hollywood is really just a neighborhood, not where they actually produce these films. But anyway, most films in the world during the 1920s are being made in America, although that will, of course, also change where you see a lot of films being made everywhere else as well. We're just kind of the pioneering area of this. Let's see. In Section 2, so just to end with Section 1, in Section 2, while life in the 1920s was roaring along, they call it the Roaring Twenties, obviously, life was certainly improving for many people. Things were becoming better. You have all these technological advances and advances in science and, rights to vote for women and so on. But, the stock market is booming in the 1920s in America. It is in good shape. This, however, would come to a crashing halt, and we'll see this in Section 2 with the Great Depression, which would spread massive inflation and debt to many other nations in the 1930s. Okay, so we'll see that in Section 2. Thanks for listening. Have a good one, guys. Bye.